morning. Hello, hello. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. We are going to go ahead and get started because we have a pretty packed agenda. We do have some light refreshments in the back, coffee that is almost finished, so if you would like any of that, please hop up at any time and feel free to grab some. I'm Haley Van Patten, for those of you that don't know me, but I'm pretty sure I know every single person in this room, so that felt a little redundant. For our guest speakers today, we do have this microphone. It is not for projection, but we are recording this meeting so that we can send it out after to people who were not able to attend. So if you're presenting, please speak into this microphone and speak as clearly as possible. And I am more than happy to click through your slides for you. I will set myself up right here. So if you would like me to do that, no problem. But I would like to turn the time over to Amber Anderson with the Utah State Historic Preservation Office, and she has a special presentation for you also. Welcome, Amber.
Is this okay? Okay. I feel like I'm going to be able to need to see, so not read, but see. I assume, can that still see me, or does it need to see me? I guess it doesn't. Or as long as the slides are, I can, okay. Okay, hi. I'm Amber Anderson. As Haley said, I work for the State Historic Preservation Office. I manage the Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit programs that we're mostly going to talk about. But before that, can you switch to the next slide? I do want to tell you, maybe, a little bit about a tool that was recently implemented that will help historic preservation efforts in Ogden, but also open the door for more tax credit projects. So that's, again, why I'm here. But so just a little, jumping forward a little bit, in order to participate in the tax credit programs, a building does have to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It can be individually listed, or it could be a contributing property in a listed historic district. And that is different than the local register, which I will explain a little bit in a couple of minutes. But so a building has to be listed in order to participate. Ogden definitely does have buildings listed on the National Register. There are individually listed buildings, and there are a couple of nationally listed historic districts. So part of 25th Street, of course, is a historic district. The East Central Historic District, I think is what it's called, from about 20th to 30th and Adams to Harrison, I want to say, is also a nationally listed historic district. So contributing properties in those districts are already eligible for the tax credit programs. But our office kind of saw a hole when it came to the commercial and industrial buildings in Ogden. So we worked with Ogden City and a local historic preservation consultant to put together this tool, which is called the Ogden Commercial and Industrial Multiple Property Submission. So MPS to make it easier. But basically this multiple property submission makes listing buildings, commercial or industrial buildings, on the National Register easier. It takes a lot of the grunt work out of it. So it's essentially just a cover document. It goes through all the historic context as it pertains to commercial and industrial buildings in Ogden from the mid-1800s through the 1970s. So it looks at the history, what was going on. It looks at the building types that were being developed in construction or constructed during these periods. It also establishes registration requirements. So basically, if you have a commercial or industrial building built between the mid-1800s to the 1970s that meets the requirements that are put forth in this document, it's eligible for the National Register. It's eligible to be listed, it's eligible for tax credits. So the document is, like I said, it's really a tool to be used to get buildings listed in order to open the door for incentives, because a lot of the work has already been done for you. It doesn't mean that the building is already listed if it meets these qualifications, but it means that it meets the qualifications, and it will be much easier, less time consuming, less expertise required in order to list it. It also just helps with other like preservation planning things, because now we know a lot more about these building types. And we estimate that probably a couple of hundred additional buildings in Ogden will now be more easily listable to the National Register and eligible for things like tax credits. So pretty exciting. That just got final approval within the last, I think it was month or two, from the National Park Service. So it is available and ready to start using. Next slide. So why do we care, right? I mean, preservation planning is great, but tax credits are really the big thing here, and those are the programs I manage. So, yep, there we go. And so I'll talk to you about, it's okay. There's 2 historic rehabilitation tax credit programs available in the state of Utah. There is a state program for residential properties or buildings that are used for a residential purpose, and there is a federal program for income-producing properties. Both of these programs provide a tax credit equivalent to about 20% of an approved project's cost. That's a credit, not a deduction. Many of you may already know the difference, but if you don't, a credit is better. A credit is a dollar-for-dollar reduction on your annual tax liability, the amount of taxes you owe or pay throughout the year. So the credit, if you get like a $5,000 tax credit, you have a $5,000 tax liability, you have a 0 tax liability. Whereas a tax deduction reduces your taxable income and thereby reduces your tax liability by a percentage, but it's just not as effective. So as I mentioned, the building has to be listed on the National Register in order to participate in these programs. It doesn't have to be listed before you start the project. It just has to be eligible, and you have to get the process started. I mean, you want to get the process started too at the beginning, because you don't want to go in thinking you're going to qualify and then find out you're not even listable. Wouldn't be a smart approach. I did mention that there's a difference between the local and the national registers. Again, you may or may not be familiar with this. There are local registers in Ogden. There's a lot more buildings in like Salt Lake that are on local registers, like the avenues. I think 25th Street here has a partial local overlay. So that's where the local overlay is, where the legal property, like restrictions, where you have to get approval from the city to do certain things. National Register listing is 100% honorary. National Register listing does not mean you can't tear your building down. It does not mean you have to get permission to do anything to the building. I mean, other than like zoning and normal like permit like stuff. But National Register listing does not require you to maintain the historic character of the property. You literally could tear it down, although we would be very upset if you did that. But where the restrictions come in is if you pursue things like tax credits. But even then, you're only required to follow certain requirements during the project and then for a few years after, and then you're back to just being a free agent, essentially. And so the last thing I have here, we will circle back to this at the end of the presentation, but in order for a tax credit project to be approved, all of the work being done to the property, inside, outside, and on the site, if the building is not, the entire site, has to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. And we will circle back to those, don't worry. Next slide. So you may have mentioned that I noticed, or you may have noticed that I mentioned the tax credits are for about 20% of an approved project's costs. So there are a few expenses that aren't eligible. All of the work has to meet the preservation standards, but some of the expenses you can't use to calculate the credit. So on the right, you see what some of those are. So purchasing the building, you can't get the credit on purchasing a historic building. You can't get it on building an addition, site work, landscaping, things like that. But pretty much anything having to do with work on the historic building itself, as well as some soft costs like architect fees, permit fees, things like that. Those are all eligible expenses. You can calculate the credit based on all of those things. Next slide. Okay, so looking a little bit closer, just briefly, the state credit, as I mentioned, is for residential use buildings. That can be owner-occupied or residential rental. It can be an apartment, it can be a house, it can be anything that's used for a residential purpose. This program is a lot more easily accessible because you only have to be spending $10,000, which I'm sure anybody that owns property knows that's pretty easy to do. Probably not even a roof, unfortunately. But so there are a couple of different timeline requirements that differ between the state and the federal programs. The state program, you have to meet that $10,000 threshold, have some kind of digestible portion of the project done within 3 years of our office's pre-approval. But there's no limit to the number of projects you do. So you could do a bunch of projects in a year for 10 to however many thousands of dollars, close it out, and then open another application round. And that one could last a year, that one could last 3 years. You can keep opening and closing them as you have work to do. And then I did mention that just being listed on the National Register does not come with any property restrictions unless you participate in these incentive programs. And so you have to follow the preservation standards during your tax credit project and for 3 additional years at the state level. But then after that, you're good to go. And so the last one is a little nuanced. So the tax credit, both the state and the federal, are considered non-refundable. So that doesn't mean you won't get the money back as a tax refund. You very well may. It just means you can't get more back in the year than your annual tax liability. So the credit is a dollar for dollar reduction of your tax liability, but you can only get up to your liability in a given year. But you can carry it forward. So for the state program, you can carry it forward for an additional 5 years. The federal program we'll look at in a minute. But so again, if you have a $5,000 tax liability, you earn a $6,000 credit. You can take all $5,000 in the first year, roll the additional $1,000 over to the next year. So, yeah. That's a great question that I definitely don't know the answer to. I would say it's probably a very specific case by case, like how your partnership is set up. So for the
other credits, like for clean our chemistry, the tip credit, and that flows through.
Yeah.
So I would think that would probably do something.
I know that, so when we issue the final paperwork for the state and the federal are going to be different too, because we're looking at totally different taxing entities. For the state program, we issue an approval for the property. So, but you need a certification number in order to claim it, and I do believe the tax commission would have a red flag if two people claim the same number. So I think you probably need, I would get like tax advice, but we have had people set it up where one partner applies for half the work and the other partner applies for the other half. That way they each get their own separate certification number at the end. It's probably something we should dive deeper into just in general, but always check with your tax person, because I'm definitely not a tax person. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the federal credit, it's for income producing buildings. What I didn't mention is that if you have a residential rental situation that meets the qualifications for both programs, you could be looking at a combined 40% tax credit, because both residential and income producing. It has to meet all the requirements for both, obviously, but a lot of our projects actually make use of both of the credits and get 40% back, which is nice. Income producing can also be office, it can be commercial, it can be, a number of different things, as long as there is an income producing use. That doesn't necessarily mean a profit, but some kind of income producing use. And then the amount that you have to spend for the federal program is trickier. It's not just a flat dollar amount like the state $10,000. It's based on the individual building's adjusted basis, which is a 4-part calculation that we're not going to look at right now, but it is something, if you're interested, we can dig deeper into it, but you would have to do some research into your specific situation. But just to simplify it, if it was a recent purchase, it's a simpler calculation. It's purchase price of the property minus the value of the land. So as you can imagine, that's much more than $10,000 usually. This program is more for substantial rehabilitations. It's usually used more for like full building projects, conversions, like redoing an entire apartment building or turning a warehouse into apartments or commercial or something like that. The federal program, typically you have to meet that adjusted basis within 2 years, but if you request a 5-year project at the beginning, you can have 5 years. So we pretty much just always encourage people to request that, because you always think it's going to be done in less than 2 years, but the amount of times people have come back and said, well, now can I request a 5-year, and it's too late. So just request it at the beginning for the most part. The federal program has an actual property ownership requirement, so you have to not only continue to follow the preservation requirements for 5 years, but you have to maintain ownership of the property for 5 years, or you have to pay the credit back. The state program does not technically have an ownership requirement, but it does have the compliance with the standards for 3 years requirement, so it would be really difficult to do if you didn't own the property, so it's kind of a weird loophole. But and then the carry forward non-refundable situation with the federal credit used to be more straightforward. Before 2017, you could, if your tax liability was large enough, you could claim the entire credit in the first year. In 2017, they made it so that you have to split it out over a minimum of 5 years. You can continue to carry it forward for an additional 16 for a total of 20 carry forward years, but it devalued the credit a little bit because you have to split it up over a minimum of 5 years when you used to be able to claim it all at once if your tax liability was large enough, which may or may not have been the case. Next slide. I won't read all these, don't worry. It's just a recap of the differences between the two programs. The thing I want to point out is at the bottom. Our office, the State Historic Preservation Office, is the one-stop shop for the state program. We have the final say. If you appeal my decision, it goes to my boss, and so it's all kind of within our office. The federal program is the National Park Service back in DC has final say. However, you still work really closely with us. We're kind of the eyes and the ears on the ground for the Park Service, and we're also just this liaison to help the applicant understand if their project qualifies, if they're doing the application correctly. We do site visits, things like that. Next slide. Review time, something everybody always wants to know. So the state program, we do have up to 30 days to get initial comments back. We never take that long. I like to get them back within like a week or so. And then there is usually back and forth if I don't have enough information to make a decision yet. The federal program definitely has longer time until you get a decision. So we have 30 days to do our initial review, but again, I like to get it done quicker, but then there is back and forth. Then it goes to the National Park Service. They have 30 days. They take all 30 days. Never have I seen them take less than 30 days. So I would expect at least 60 days, depending on how familiar you are with the application process. Because if you send me an application that's perfect, buttoned up, ready to go, we can get it out of my office in 10 days. The Park Service has 30, we're looking at under 60 days. But it really just depends on what I receive and then how much we feel that we need to go back and forth. If a building is not already listed on the National Register and you need to start that process, it's a little bit different. Our National Register reviewer in our office has 45 days. The National Park Service has 45 days on that end. But these things can be done simultaneously. You don't have to wait till the building is listed, till you have an approved nomination in order to start the tax credit application process. Those can happen at the same time. Next slide. Okay, so if you or somebody you know is interested in getting started, my first piece of advice would just be to reach out. We can have an initial conversation, see if your building's already listed on the National Register, see if it's eligible to be listed on the National Register, see if the use of your building makes sense for both or one or the other state or federal programs. We can also have an initial chat about what kind of work you're thinking about doing and if it's anywhere within the realm of approvability or if it can be brought back into the realm of approvability. We can have that chat. If for some reason you don't want to reach out beforehand, although I highly encourage that you do, thoroughly document the building. If we don't know what you started with, it's really hard to understand if you did work that met the standards. Projects have been denied because we just didn't have enough before documentation. So reach out, take a bunch of photos, and then best case scenario is to have an approved before application before you start work. Legally, you don't have to, but it's just the safest thing to do is to have an approved application because sometimes you can't fix things that have been done that don't meet the standards. So sometimes you can, but it costs you more money. So best case is to just apply before you start. Next slide. Okay, I'm gonna look at some case studies, but before I get into that, I wanted to take a question, if there are any other questions or thoughts. But depending on when we get done, maybe. Potentially, actually. Yeah.
So what is the number one thing where you've had something approved and then the owner has done something that is not on the list that makes you reject their application?
That's a great, that's a great question. Do you want me to repeat it?
Sure.
So the question was, when we have an approved application, what's the number one thing that ends up happening that we have to deny the project, essentially? So exposed brick, usually they divulge that at the beginning and we're able to say that's probably not going to be approvable. If it were to come back and they had exposed it, we can, depending on how bad it is and the specific situation, what they started with, again, they can cover it back up if that would suffice the rest of the requirements. Do you have any thoughts, Jansen, on painting brick? That's one. Yes, painting brick, and I'll get into this a little bit, is bad for it. please don't do it. It's not good for it. I'll explain why, but so that's definitely one that can cause denial. Pretty much, I mean, any like hard left turn off of what you were approved to do is just not safe. So it can be any number of things. Taking out windows that you said you were going to restore, tossing them in the trash, like any kind of character defining feature that was there and you were going to preserve and then we find out you just didn't and didn't talk to us about is not going to end well. So anything else? Okay. Oh, yeah.
What would you say the time limit?
So technically anything that's at least 50 years old could potentially be eligible for the National Register. It has to have a certain amount of integrity and like significance, but that document, so you don't have to use that document I talked about, but it's just another tool to help facilitate the process. But yeah, so what year is it? 2022. Mid 70s, we are starting to look, 1970s, we're starting to look at. So yeah, it's whenever anyone says anything like that, I have to go back to the Victorian discussion. I always bring, Jansen knows this. Jansen is our historical architect, by the way. He's hiding in the back. He can provide lots of advice for your projects. People hated Victorian architecture back in the day. When it first came out, they hated it. They thought it was terrible. They thought nothing was good during that era. And now it's like one of the things we fiercely protect. So we have to think about it in context. Even better. Is that the one right over here? I was walking by that and I thought it was great. So I don't know if it's already listed. I'm sure it's eligible to be listed if someone ever needs to do a tax credit project with it. But okay, now for some just kind of fun case studies before we circle back to the standards. So this project, some of you may be familiar with if you ever hang out in Salt Lake City. It's the EVO campus that just recently opened in the last 6 months. Historically, this was a grouping of warehouses built from I think it was actually the 1880s through the 1950s, originally housing the Salt Lake Rapid Transit trolley cars for maintenance, storage, things like that. And so over time, it turned into just a series of warehouses. And most recently, it was just a hodgepodge of different businesses and storage kind of facilities. But so they just got their final federal approval, which was extremely exciting for me. It was a tough project, I will give you that. But so they turned this whole complex into just this great mixed-use facility. There's a bouldering gym, there's a skate park, there's a restaurant, there's a hotel, there's a coffee shop. There's just a ton of really great, fun, community-oriented things that have been put into these buildings, and they just got approved for tax credits. Their full cost was about $26 million, but 20% of their eligible cost was about $3.9 million. So they are getting back $3.9 million in federal tax credits because they followed this process. Next slide. So here's kind of a look at historic before and after. So this is this is what they started with. And they did want to build a rooftop addition, which is normally not approvable on such a short, visible building. It dramatically changes the scale of the building. But we did have historic evidence that for a time, the building on the most visible side had this sign explaining what the building was. So we were able to put together an argument for the National Park Service that recreating the sign could shield the rooftop addition, and therefore it wouldn't affect the character of the property. It was a close call, but yeah. So here's the interior. This is one of the there's outdoor retailers in here as well. So kind of a before and after. They kept a lot of that industrial exposed brick character. So when you have an industrial building, back to the exposed brick, leaving it exposed makes sense. It's the historic character. It's original to the building, as well as these exposed beamworks, the truss system. You can see that they just didn't do a lot. They stabilized, they made it habitable, but they really kept that historic character. Next slide. And these are all just after photos of different spaces. There was one area I found out afterwards where there wasn't enough head clearance, so they got their engineer to sign off on just cutting a little bit out of the beam so that they could make it work. And then this is the hallway through some of the hotel rooms. So in there are the different hotel rooms. You can see some of the original signage on the brick in the new skate park. Just a very, very fun project. This is in Logan, the Borden Lofts project. It was historically a milk plant constructed in 1908. They turned this into apartments, so they got both state and federal tax credits. Their project cost was about $9.5 million, and they were eligible for about 1.5 state, 1.5 federal, so $3 million in tax credits back for doing this project. I don't have before pictures, I apologize, other than the historic one. But you can see they maintained that historic character, that exposed kind of rough brickwork, this stack, the smokestack, concrete, anything new they put in was kind of a steel or wood system. Next slide. And then here's some of the units as well. Okay, this last case study was a simple 1950s USPS fleet vehicle building. That's, again, they stored and maintained fleet vehicles in Salt Lake City's historic warehouse district. They turned this into an office, and they spent about $3.1 million and were eligible for about $630,000 in federal tax credits. Next slide. So the coloring, they didn't change the coloring, it's just overcast one day. Just thought I'd point that out. But so before and after of the front, pretty straightforward. They were able to keep all the original steel casement windows, which was really great because these windows are such character-defining features of the property. They really evoke that sense of a factory with the operable awning or hopper section. Hopper? Is that right? Yeah. Keeping those was really a really good part of the project. The interior, you see they didn't do a lot of changes. They made it livable. They polished the floors. They furred out some of the walls for electrical and insulation purposes, but they were able to keep the barrel vault. Any new ductwork had an industrial feel to it. Next slide. And then where they did have to build some walls for private offices, they used wood and steel and glass and things like that, all in keeping with the original character of the property. Okay, for the last section, open it up again. Thoughts, questions, concerns? Okay, I swear it's only 10 more slides, but this is an important part. So in order to get any of these tax credits, you have to follow the standards for rehabilitation. And I just do like to point out that there are 4 sets of standards that the National Park Service puts out. We use the rehabilitation standards, but there are also preservation, which means just basically fixing something in place. It means not allowing for change, not taking it back to a certain time, just kind of preserving in place. Standards for restoration, this one is taking it back to something, to a certain period based on historical evidence. We don't do that either. And then reconstruction is pretty self-explanatory. We do the standards for rehabilitation. So with these, we do allow for new and modern uses in order to keep a building alive and thriving and usable into the future. But what we do is we identify the historic character-defining features of the property. And we do our best to maintain those, replicate them if absolutely necessary, essentially just maintain them if possible. And so character-defining features can be the scale of the building, it can be the materials, it can be the windows, it can be the floor plan, it can be some decorative detail, it can be any number of things that tell the story of what the building originally was, who designed it, why they designed it, the style, all of these things. Next slide. This is all of them. We'll go through them one by one. Next slide. Okay. So standard number 1 is a property shall be used either for its historic purpose or placed in a new use that requires minimal change to those character-defining features. So here's an example of meeting the standard number 1 and not meeting standard number 1. So on this first photo, just kind of like some of the case studies we looked at, it was a warehouse. They turned it into open office space. They didn't have to do much to the building. They may have furred out some of the walls, but they left a lot of them exposed. They left a lot of the steel and concrete exposed. They maintained that large open volume of space characteristic of a warehouse. They didn't even have to put in like tall walls. They were able to use cubicles. So they did a really nice job of meeting standard number 1. On the right-hand side, standard number 2, however, cool project, don't get me wrong, not hating on it, but doesn't meet standard number 1 because obviously they took a historic church and they totally changed the interior character. The exterior might have looked exactly the same. It's hard to say. But by dividing it up into apartments, they subdivided those large, tall, religious worship spaces that are characteristic of a church. They also took the plaster off the walls, which in a church would never have been the case. It would have been sacrilegious, I assume. It would have been a highly finished space, highly decorative, and so removing that plaster actually took the historic character away from it. Next slide. Standard number 2 is that the historic character of a property shall be retained and preserved. The removal of historic materials or alteration of features and spaces that characterize a property shall be avoided. So this is a before and after that didn't meet the standards. This is a historic office building in downtown Salt Lake City. On the historic photo on the left, you can see, highly finished plaster, woodwork, wood casings, wainscoting, crown molding, just highly finished. Floors probably had either hardwood or carpet or something like that. And on the right, the after, that's totally changed. They not only got rid of any semblance of the floor plan that was there, which would have been a very central corridor with offices off of it. They also removed all the finishes. They removed the ceiling height. They added these industrial, like ductwork vibes. They unfinished the walls and the floor, just completely changing the historic office character of the space. Next slide. Standard number 3 is that each property shall be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding conjectural features or architectural elements from other buildings, shall not be undertaken. So this one I realize seems a little harsh. This specific situation, the building was originally a 1930s bank building up in Morgan, which is on the left is the before picture. On the right is them adding back in some walls and some doors, which are obviously historic doors, but those doors predated the building by about 20 years and came from New Jersey in a schoolhouse. So not the same use of building, not the same era of building, not the same location, probably a different wood species, basically changing the historic record of this building by adding something that would never have been there. Next slide. Okay, standard number 4, most properties change over time. Those changes that have acquired historic significance in their own right shall be retained and preserved. This one may come as a shock as well. So the Union Block building in Brigham City, we are working with them on a tax credit project, and they've gotten grant money from our offices over the years for different facade upgrades, things like that. So we've worked with them a lot. But the original facade looked like this. It was divided into 2 different storefronts with these divided lights, double doors, but pretty early on in the building's what we call period of significance, which is the period of time when it was its most significant. I guess that's pretty straightforward. But pretty early on, they switched to this, which was partially for structural reasons because they added in a really significant beam there. But so they changed it to that. They upgraded it to more of a 19-teens style with the prism glass, the operable hoppers, or maybe they were awnings, I'm not sure. But so when they came to us, they had what you see on the far right, which was a 1980s, I believe, facade, which we didn't consider historically significant. But when they were trying to figure out what to do with the facade as part of their tax credit project, we had a lot of conversations with the National Park Service about whether or not it was more appropriate to take it back to this or this. And so given the historic evidence as well as some structural reasons, we ultimately decided that this facade had acquired more historic significance. It was there for more of the historic period. It just made more sense for the building. So that was the one that they were required to use if they wanted to take it back to something historically accurate. They could have absolutely kept this and still gotten tax credits, but they wanted to change it. And because we didn't consider it significant, they were allowed to change it, but it had to be based on evidence. So next slide. Standard number 5, distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize a historic property shall be preserved. Another example from Salt Lake City that doesn't meet the standards. These guys came to us well into their project, unfortunately, and did not get tax credits. So they started with this very 1930s art moderne design with these horizontal score work, this vertically oriented tile entrance, the stucco, the windows, and they felt like they were taking it back to something more historically accurate by taking all that off, taking all the plaster off, because they felt like it would have been exposed brickwork, which it never would have been. This design is very characteristic of the era in which the building was built. So They tried to create a false sense of history by removing craftsmanship that actually characterized the property. Next slide. Standard number 6, deteriorated historic features shall be repaired rather than replaced where the severity of deterioration requires replacement of a distinctive feature, shall match in design, color, texture, blah, blah, blah. If you're replacing something that the historic feature wasn't already there, you need evidence in order to do so. Windows are a big one. So we look at windows very, very closely. Our first priority is always to keep the ones you have, and there's a lot of misconceptions about windows and and whether or not you can repair them, whether or not you can make them more energy efficient. There are a lot of ways to work with existing, especially wood windows. There are a lot of things you can do besides replace them. So that's always our first priority, but if they do need replaced and you need to have some kind of evidence as to why that is, they need to be replaced with as close of a match as physically possible. So we look at the proportions of the stiles and the rails, the muntins, how deep they sit out from the glass, the molding profiles if they're intricate. We look at all of those details. So first priority, keep what you have. They've worked for 100 years. We can probably fix them. If you can't do that, they need to look like they did. So next slide. Okay, this one. This is back to the painting the brick. Standard number 7, chemical or physical treatments such as sandblasting that cause damage to historic materials shall not be used. The cleaning surface of structures, if appropriate, shall be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. So there's a lot of things that happen to historic masonry that are not good for it. A lot of well-intentioned things that actually lead to deterioration down the road. Sandblasting, which is what you see has happened here, is on the left. Sandblasting is a big one. If a building has already been painted, if it's dirty, people think sandblasting is the best way to fix it. It is not. Historic brick was made it was fired in such a way that the interior was soft, the exterior was hard. The exterior is the protective outer coating. So when you use any kind of abrasive blasting, even if it's not a super high pressure, it will chip away at that exterior protective outer coating. And you might not see it at first, but as time goes on and weather and biogrowth, freeze-thaw cycles happen, the chipping will get bigger and bigger and bigger until you start to see it, and it'll just eventually deteriorate and slough off, and the building's or the brick's integrity is ruined. So another misguided thing that we see happen a lot, you can see on the right-hand photo, is using a mortar that is too hard for the historic assembly. Portland cement is the death of most historic brickwork, especially the further back you go. Again, brick is meant to expand and contract. It is historically meant to change size because of the way it's fired again and the materials that are used. And so when a brick can't expand and contract because there is a hard Portland cement next to it, rather than the mortar being the sacrificial element, the brick becomes the sacrificial element. And the mortar will stay there just fine and dandy, but the brick will start to crack and break and eventually slough off, and you get this salmon-y kind of just powder, which is obviously not structurally sound. Painting brick also has similar problems. Brick was not meant to be painted for the most part. There are very few exceptions. If you go far enough back, and then it's a certain kind of paint, and most situations it's not meant to be painted. When you paint brick, it traps in moisture. A lot of people think that painting it is going to protect it from moisture. It is not. Moisture will get in. From the bottom, from the top, from the inside, from breathing, from rising damp, from a leak in your roof, it's gonna get in. So it needs to get out. So if you paint the brick, it traps the moisture in because it will be there. And then again, you have the same thing happen where the brick holds onto the moisture, freeze thaw happens, it expands and contracts, can't go anywhere because the paint is there, the brick breaks down. So these are all things that we really try to educate people on why you don't want to do them. A lot of contractors, a lot of people don't realize these things. So we're happy when we have our architect who can get into those details. Next slide. This one, if you have an archaeological resource that is affected by a project, we do need to consider it. I'm not an archaeologist though, so I would send you to people in our office who are. Essentially, if something is going to be affected by your project, so This is the Rio Grande Depot in Salt Lake City. There obviously used to be rail lines there. There's likely a lot of archaeological evidence still there in the ground. If you're going to build something directly behind it, we need to assess whether or not archaeology is going to be affected. Next slide. Okay, last two standards, they have a lot of overlap. So new additions, exterior alterations, new construction shall not destroy historic materials that characterize the property. The new work shall be differentiated from the old, but also be compatible. And then standard number 10, new additions or adjacent construction shall be undertaken in such a way that if removed in the future, the historic building is not ruined. Apparent, something like that. So this is a really good example of how both of these standards were met. This is the Rio Grande Depot, where our office used to be, maybe again in the future, thanks to an earthquake. But so this addition was built for the archives, the state archives, in a way that meets both of these. So the new addition is obviously not trying to be old. It's clearly a new building, but it is compatible. It doesn't overshadow the existing building. It has similar language with the banding and the materiality and the window alignment, but it's clearly not an original feature. The scale, it is set slightly back, it is set slightly below, it doesn't compete with the historic building, and then it's also attached by a glass hyphen. So if that were to be removed, the historic building would be fine. Next slide. Okay, these are some great resources if you want to pursue tax credits or not, even if you just have a historic building and you want to take care of it. So this one is the one that I recommend the most because it's an alphabetized list of pretty much anything you could think of. Like, what do I do with my masonry? What do I do with my windows? How do I remove paint? Or how do I, pick the best paint or things like that? You can go to M for masonry, W for windows, and there's just a ton of different articles and guidance that the National Park Service has put out or collected that help you do things that we would consider meeting the standards. Next slide. Now I'm done. But yeah, so this is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out. We love helping people get tax credit projects going or just providing advice in general. Whether you need to use the multiple property nomination tool or not, our office is here as a resource, so please let us know. Okay, anything? Okay.
Thank you so much, Amber. A lot of good information.